Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. I've got Tamir Ali Al-Rahedi, and he is the owner of the From First Principles podcast with Tamir on YouTube that you can go find on YouTube. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Really excited to talk to you, man.
So we were recording a bunch and had some internet connectivity issues, but we're back and we're
Yeah.
going to talk. Let's talk about the book. Um, do you remember the book that I'm writing?
Yes, actually, we read it before this interview. I read it yesterday, and it was the chapter you were talking, the one you wrote, right?
Yes. Yep. So, well,
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to actually make sure I understood what you've written there. So yeah, I reread it
what
again.
is the impression that you have of the book that I want to write?
It's a really good idea, I think. Like the delving into the nature of questions is really interesting, and I think there's a lot of many different angles you can delve into it. So you can delve into it from the angle of questions themselves, and then what questions do for us as humans, and then what is the nature of an insightful answer, if that makes sense.
Ooh,
So
yes.
I think of it in that way. Yeah. So I think you can tackle it from what is an insightful answer. Like that would open up a
Ooh.
whole kind of worms, let's say, when it comes to the nature of questions, which we can delve into. I was actually thinking about it from while I was reading the paper, or sorry, the chapter you've written. I was thinking about it from the angle of answers, which is you didn't necessarily delve into it into that chapter. You were talking about questions, but I was like thinking about it more from the answers perspective, and it gave me a lot of insights. I actually started to write and stuff like that. So yeah, I think it's a super interesting question. And yeah, we can delve into the whole chapter because I read it like actually two times, so I think I understood the whole thing you were trying to convey.
Great. So, and my book writing strategy has shifted since then because you mentioned a can of worms, and I have opened up a giant can of worms, which is what is the history of questions in the Western civilization, and I have found no other people who have even come close to attempting it. There are a bunch of people who have written about curiosity, but they're all stuck in the scientism framework, and I think the scientism framework
Mm-hmm.
is basically like it's the opposite of interdisciplinary. And I know that you're a
Okay,
generalist
that's
as well. And interdisciplinary is where the generalists shine. And we have essentially been ignored for the past 40 or 50 years because of the scientism, which just focuses on really specific things and it forgets the context of whatever we're talking about. So I've opened up this giant can of worms, which I realized that if I were to fully delve into that original book that I sent you, it would take me the next 10 years. And so I want to
wow.
I want to get a book out before then. And so I've now shifted to well, I'm going to still write that book in over the 10 years, but I've shifted now to getting it really well defined because I'm starting a consultancy and most consultants have a book that they have. And so I want to write a book in a much
Mm.
shorter time period all about what questions do for us inside of business. And so I'm getting to a specific point which you mentioned, which is the answers. So I wrote on LinkedIn, I've got my thesis. My thesis for this new book is questions generate all the value inside of a business. And then everybody else
Okay.
was like, no, answers generate the value. And so then
Mm.
based on that, I now say questions generate the value in business, answers capture the value in business. They define
Okay.
it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think they kind of like overlap in a lot of ways. Like I don't really think you can really distinguish the nature of what questions and answers do. So the way I think about it is that the nature of, like, let's say, the best answers, like you can tackle it from that perspective, which is the perspective I was talking to you about. You can see the best answers as the ones that generate as much questions as they answer.
Oh,
It
nice. I
seems
like it.
paradoxical.
I like it.
Yeah, it seems quite paradoxical, but I think the best answers are usually the ones that, not in a skeptical way, not in a like a very destructive skeptical way,
Hmm.
but they generate questions in a pokey way, like you kind of like you get, even on a podcast level, like I think this is something you kind of experience. The best podcast answers are the ones that make it easier for you to ask the next question,
Yes,
even though it
100%.
seems paradoxical. But I think that is something that is kind of like a it's one like it's embedded in the nature of a question and answer.
Mm,
So could you say the
yeah.
sentence you mentioned about like the questions capture the value of business
Yeah,
and then
the
the
questions,
answers generate?
no, questions generate the value in business and answers capture the value. They stabilize, the questions are dynamic, answers are static.
Okay, that
Does that
makes
make sense?
sense.
Yep.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It makes sense also in the context of business because I think once you think about it from the angle of like, I guess pursuing truth, it would be kind of different
Ooh,
than
interesting.
kind of thinking about it from the business perspective because
Well,
in a business you kind of have to like assume a lot of things and don't like you kind of have to have this false sense of certainty in a way
mm,
in order to start a business to like
uh,
take the next step. I feel like, but when it comes to philosophy you can keep those threads open, let's say. And so the nature of the investigation of questions is actually different when it comes to philosophy and pursuing truth than a business, I would say. Because a business you could in some ways like focus on the answers in a way to try to take the next step so you don't get too lost, because you need to, at the end of the day, as a business you need to generate revenue, you need to like create money in order to sustain a business in a meaningful way. So yeah, I think it's super interesting that you kind of diverged into it. I think it's a subset of the
of the
question,
larger
which is like
question.
how exactly. Yeah.
So you just brought up something really interesting because one random tweet from like 10 years ago that is just stuck in my head is that entrepreneurs the thing that separates entrepreneurs from everyone else is that entrepreneurs have a sense of truth seeking. So because yes, I agree that you can the businesses are not at all interested or focused on questions of philosophical truth, but they are very, very much focused on the truth of the market. And if somebody is
Yeah,
not
for sure.
focused on the truth of the market, then they're going to lose. There's another thing that I've learned since then, which is that the market it's not so top down. I don't even know if it was top down what I just said, but it's not so the market is there as this thing that exists outside of human imagination. The market is out there, but it's also incontrovertibly wrapped up with our subjective observation of the market. And people like,
100%.
yeah, people like Sam Altman are using hype in order to capture business value. And I would say that hype is fantasy, some part of which is real and true. What do you think on that?
Okay. Got it. Yeah, it's interesting because I think, as you said, the manifestations of the market are almost like our subconscious thoughts that we
Ooh,
don't know. That's why it's
interesting.
the ultimate feedback because it's kind of like playing on our subconscious and it's manifesting certain behaviors that we might not be aware of. But at the end of the day, that thing, which is the market, is giving us feedback towards our subconscious thoughts or what have you. Because, like, if you look at it from the perspective of demand towards social media, for instance, scrolling or whatever,
Mm,
it seems to be playing at something at
mm,
our subconscious,
mhm.
or I don't know what it is. It's not necessarily something that is conscious, but it's playing at some impulse that we have.
Yeah, because
And
we go
so
to
as soon
it
as
as an addiction, right? We go to it as whenever we're feeling empty of something, we go and scroll, and it seems to be t completely universal. Like I don't think I know of anyone who is not stuck in that loop. What do you
yeah,
think?
yeah, you can
Mhm.
control it to more or less, but I think at the end of the day, like that's how the market is kind of the truth because it speaks to the things that are that we actually do in the real world, not necessarily the things that are present in our conscious or the things that we want to do, but the things that are present in our subconscious. So from that perspective, it is the ultimate. The market is like a form of truth in a way, which I think like adds to this idea of questions and answers. And I think one thing we can tackle this topic, I guess, from another angle, which is like the nature of an insightful answer.
Mm.
So how would you think of like what would you say is an insightful answer to you? Would you say that it's one that gives you a sense of certainty, or is it one that
Mm.
like what would you say is something that is you find an insightful answer, or is it too broad to
Mm.
kind of be
No,
answered
no,
in a
no,
meaningful
no, no. This is really good territory. It reminds me of energetic. There's an energetic carrier wave or an attractor field or some sort of I in my view, in my perception, that is spiritual in nature,
Mhm.
not when it comes to business, but when it comes to ultimate truth, there is a carrier wave which each statement or answer comes with. And depending on the source of that, whether it's an enlightened being or somebody
Mm.
who's a very high consciousness level, will affect me in a very profound way. What's interesting, though, is that humans can also simulate insightful answers, and so somebody with a very low consciousness can say the same thing because they've read it from somebody with a high consciousness, and that same statement will actually not be as high or not be as profound towards me, particularly, or I assume everyone else. So there's something about spiritual energy power. There's something about power that is transmitted in answers. And that has to deal with not only the content of the answer, but the context of the answer and who is saying it. What are all the things,
Yeah,
including both seen and unseen. And I think both of us probably agree on this, is that the unseen is some ways more important than the seen, than the context or the content.
100%.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, 100%. So it's almost like the source and the receiver are
Mm-hmm.
almost one of the most important factors of an answer, not the content of the answer
It is.
itself, which is
Mm-hmm.
quite interesting. And I think that's true. There's actually a quote that speaks to this, which is it speaks to the receiver, which is
Mm-hmm.
that people can only see to the depths that they're willing to see within themselves.
Yep.
So a source cannot give unless there's like an enlightened receiver,
Yeah.
let's
Or
say,
yeah, or somebody
which is
who's
kind of
yeah.
an interesting angle to think about.
And how does this deal with business? Like the that sort of just like absolute context that we were just talking from. How does this deal with a very practical? And this is another thing that I'm trying to figure out with the business is that the book, it's to an audience of people who are entrepreneurs and founders, and most of them would completely not most, a lot of
Mm,
them would completely ignore, disregard everything we just were talking about as impractical and not very helpful. And how can I bring what I just said or what we were just talking about down to a
yeah,
practical level of like this will improve your ROI, your return on investment?
entrepreneurs, I guess you would have to speak the language of numbers in a way, which like I hate. I kind of hate to
Yeah,
say it in this context
yeah.
because there are so many things that are deeper than numbers. But I think you would have to kind of link it to listen. If you get like the ultimate insightful answer is the one that
Ooh.
generates you the most money. I think that would, yeah,
Yeah.
I think that would be the thing that most entrepreneurs would think of an insight as an insightful answer. So an insightful answer is the one that brings you the most revenue or whatever. But in the context of other things, that wouldn't be a sufficient answer,
And so
I would say.
to bound it within a category of insightful answers that generate money. Ooh, this is a good one. Insightful answers that generate revenue. Um, and this reminds me, I go back and forth.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah, go for it. Mhm.
yeah. Yeah, go ahead. I want to like cut your stream of thoughts. Go ahead.
So I did some investigation with the LLM on Uber. And I wanted a strong example of the way that questions could generate value. And so it gave me Uber as an example. And in the story, I don't think it actually happened like this. It says that Uber and the founders of Uber basically were like, they started with the question of what would a world look like if I could press a button and have a car show up? And so that
Mm,
question generated the entire company of Uber. Is not that simplistic. That's not the way that it really happened, but that's kind of like the myth of what had happened, right? And so
yeah,
the answer that generated value was the Uber app that we have now, right?
yeah,
Would that
yes,
would
yes.
that connect enough to that practical level?
Yeah, I would say that like this also ties back to the source thing that we were saying. So the
Mm-hmm.
founder was thinking about this question in his head, and he thought that the most insightful answer would be the Uber thing. and then he had feedback from the source,
Yeah,
which is the
feedback.
market,
Yeah.
and then it kind of clicked together, and he kind of confirmed the question. So I think it kind of ties back to this idea of the source and the receiver.
Yeah.
So the receiver was willing to pay money, and then the source was willing to put some kind of contribution to what he thought is an insightful answer, and then it kind of clicked and generated like revenue or whatever it is, or made some impact in the market.
And that gives me the idea of what I need to do in order to get that. I need to put that story up in the front. Maybe not Uber, but I'll choose a great example. Maybe Steve Jobs, maybe Apple or
Mm-hmm.
something like that, where they start with a
Yeah.
question, but then they do truth seeking, and then I can essentially separate that truth seeking into the various activities that a founder or an entrepreneur does in that process. What do you think?
Okay. Okay, that's interesting. But would you say that this, like, how would this process look like in a way? Like, would you have to describe like the whole story and how like Steve Jobs came up with the idea or the question, or would it be more at
Uh,
a market level? How would you?
well, I want to get it out before I forget it. That what you just said is interesting in terms of what Steve Jobs specifically did, and I can bring the spiritual into it. And I love this story
Yeah.
that so Steve Jobs existed with a very interesting context, which is that he was in Silicon Valley, and there is a strain of Silicon Valley that is hippie, but it's very small, and everybody has to pretend that they're not part of it, which Steve Jobs didn't do. And he was surrounded by people who believe in scientism. That scientism, and in some ways, Steve Jobs himself was also part of the scientism thing. But he
Wow.
went to India and he did his truth seeking at the spiritual level, and he did a bunch of LSD, and LSD was like fundamental to what became Apple. Um, and so at his funeral, a whole bunch of really powerful rich people came to his funeral, and Steve Jobs had it in his will that he gave everybody the book, The Autobiography of a Yogi, by Yogananda, which is just this total fantasy
Okay.
book that goes into, Yogananda has his guru who's not an actual individual physical guru, but is like an avatar who's living in the mountains and like dispenses with this like very important psychic messages, like just totally crazy stuff according to the science of book. So this is great. I think it will be Steve Jobs. I think I will start with a story of Steve Jobs, that story, and then go into how that truth seeking and his ability to ask questions uh, and truth seek. So I have to go back and study Steve Jobs specifically in terms of
Mm.
his question style. I think that's a really good way to start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's such an interesting character. Like I think he like speaking of Steve Jobs, I believe he kind of like quit Apple for like 10 years and he started another company and then that
He was
was
fired.
acquired by like
He was fired.
yeah, he was fired. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So the amount of tenacity that you need in order to like be patient on something for like 10 years and then come back again, like I would say that that guy is like he's something else when it comes to even this topic of like question asking and
Yeah.
insightful answers.
It's something to do
So I
really
think he has
with the
like
person.
this ability to see. Yeah, I was gonna say that he has this ability to kind of see or foresee like the most insightful answers of the market. If you like kind of stayed for like 10 years doing a thing without having any results and then it clicked, then there must be something that is with this guy's like question generation mechanism or whatever you want to call
Ooh,
it.
there it is. Yeah. It's that power. It's the power we were talking about, and Steve Jobs was a force of nature. So, and they talked about the reality disturbance field, but most people talk about the reality disturbance field in relation to how they felt around Steve Jobs. But there's
Okay.
another aspect of the disturbance field, which is that the ability to focus one's attention into a question and then find the answers. Well, this gets back into what we were talking about whether the market is real and outside of us, or whether we have an effect on the market, and it's both. But this
Yeah.
sort of like there's this effect that we have on the universe by observing the universe. Like that seems incontrovertible. Quantum mechanics, the effect of the observer is real, and when we observe something, we have an effect on it. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. Yes. Yeah, I think even Stephen Wolfram makes this point, I believe. And I think I'm not sure if he made it on one of your podcasts, but he's saying that even the laws of physics would be different had our minds been different. So Stephen Wolfram would say that if we don't have this idea of a one stream of consciousness that we're like disturbed, like for example, me across time, like all of my atoms are kind of different across time, but I think of myself as
Yeah,
this
yeah.
one stream of consciousness. So Stephen Wolfram was kind of saying that had we didn't think of ourselves as like one stream of consciousness, all the laws of physics would be different.
Whoa.
And so I think the same happens with everything. Like you can apply this idea to any level of abstraction you would like, whether it's economics or
Yeah.
whatever.
And this is good.
So yeah.
So I'm gonna start the book with really practical stuff. Like imagine the most boring management consultant stuff, except for that. So it'll be Steve Jobs with his crazy story to hook people into this idea that there is this power that exists that's spiritual in nature. But I won't mention any of that stuff. And then I'll go from that to really practical stuff about how questions can lead to billions of dollars of revenue. And then I'll go into the science of questions, and like what's
Mm.
happening behind the scenes in the brain and groups of people and the cognitive science and everything like that. And then I won't cover it because this will be covered in that second book, but I'll leave a little kind of hint
Okay.
of the spiritual nature, I think, of it. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, which one would you say is yeah, that's actually it's almost like a stepping stone, but I would say that it's the other way around would be more insightful, but I believe you have
What
some
do you mean?
practical like reasons to go for the second one first. So I mean if you start with the first with the other one, the one that is not linked to the business,
Yeah.
it would be more insightful towards the other book if that makes sense. It would kind of build up the context for it and then you
Oh,
can go to something more specific. But I think that would take
oh,
a lot of like, as you said, it would take like 10 years or whatever.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a question.
Because I would say that those, like the things you discussed on the chapter, yeah, go ahead. I
So
think it lagged. Just give me a second.
sure.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
there's a question of um what I maybe I should even start with even a different book, which is like what is the book that I could write right now with knowing my own knowledge of all the things I've studied in the podcast related to questions. Is it this is the problem I have in general. I imagine that you also have it, is the generalist curse is how to start, how to do something, how to finish, how to
Yes,
start, not only how to start, but how to finish as well.
exactly.
Yeah, which feels
Yes.
like the generalist curse of how to actually finish something, because there's all these interesting avenues and how to cut off the thread. And this is, I think, what gets to discernment. What do you think about discernment? How does discernment show up in your life?
I think, like for me, I would say that I struggle with this idea, as you mentioned. As I said, like a generalist is a person who likes to keep threads open, and that's a blessing and a curse at the same time, as you said. So yeah, I think I kind of, but the way I would think about it, like for me, even when it comes to book writing, so I kind of at one time I thought I wanted to write a book about like some ideas, some subset of ideas in Ian Miguel Christ's book, which is The
Mm.
Master and His Emissary. I've written like a blog post that is like titled "Limits That Unlimit." So I wanted to kind of take this idea and extend it, but then I was actually questioning the whole idea of writing a book. So I was like, okay, one second, why do I want to write a book? Okay, I can write as much articles as I want about the topic, but why am I like targeting a book specifically? And then
Yeah,
I kind of
yeah, yeah.
put that on the side and I was like, okay, I'm just going to focus on just writing the articles and trying to, I guess, make my ideas concrete through other routes. It doesn't have to necessarily be
Oh
a
man.
book that is, yeah. And so I think that was my solution to the generalist curse, which is like I can just write articles about things all the time and just attune to this generalist piece of myself or my soul. So that was my answer. I'm not sure if that's the perfect answer for you. Maybe it's
Well,
your
because
time to write a book, but
that was Twitter for me. That was Twitter for me about 6 years ago. Was realizing that
okay.
I don't
Wow.
that I can just write on Twitter and get all my thoughts out and turn it into my knowledge management system. Um, But now I'm trying to go from short form to long form. But I think it is. I think that's what I have to do. I think I have to write a blog. I have to write a medium form blog post
Yes.
every day, and that will get, and then over that, and aim for the about, no, is it a chapter? Because so we've got short form, which is a tweet or a video or a 2 minute video or a clip or anything like that. We have medium form, which is maybe like a 5 page blog
Mhm.
post.
Yeah.
And then we have
Yep.
a chapter. And then we have a set of
Yeah.
chapters, which is a book. How long were your articles?
I think probably like maybe
5 pages.
the maximum one would be a 50-minute read, probably.
15
Like a lot of
minutes
the times, even
time.
when I'm,
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
yeah, like it's linked with time. I would say it's like it takes 15 minutes to read. And the thing about, like, as you said, there's usefulness in all of those categories. There's
Yep.
usefulness in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. I just think that it's, especially when you're kind of just unraveling or just scratching the surface of something,
Yeah.
like starting with the medium term
Yeah.
as a,
Yeah. I think you're
that
right.
was like my answer towards the generalism. Because I would, for example, if we take Ian McGilchrist's book as an example, I would go and read the references that he links. So if I want to focus in on some idea, I would be missing out on those other open threads. So I didn't want to, like, at that time kind of miss out on those, like, open threads, I would say. And so that was like my answer towards the
Yeah.
generalism curse.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think I think it's too big. I think I'm going too long. I need to do a medium form. Because
Yeah.
if
But it also,
yeah,
yeah,
go for it. Yep.
yeah, I wanted to say that the medium term and the short term will inform you what
The
should,
long term.
or at least what will the long term, like, kind of pour into, if that makes sense.
It
Like you'll
does.
have a sharper idea.
Well, and
So
the
yeah.
craziest thing about AI is that, and I want to interview you about your use of AI, because for me it's been generalist crack. It's like generalist crack cocaine. Like that's what it feels like to go have an LLM. Is just like now every thread I can investigate to my heart's content. Is that what's going on with you? Or
I would say no. I
no?
actually started
Interesting.
off with
Yeah.
this. Yeah, yeah. So I started off with some excitement with LLMs, let's say, but I always had the fear of me outsourcing my brain to this machine
Mm,
in
mhm,
some way.
mhm, mhm.
So I was super scared because the way I think about it is the more specific the technology, the more it has like power over you in some
Oh,
ways. Like the
interesting.
more specific it is, like I would say that, for example, Google search, or like, this is the way I think about
Yeah.
it in some ways. Like I think the arc of learning should be like from the most hard way to learn to the, I guess, and then you can gradually make it easier. So I would say that if you want to start, or at least that's the way I do it in some ways. When I start out learning a specific topic, I would go through the route of books, which is probably the most difficult in some ways. And then I would gradually move towards like articles and then researching specific questions about it on Google, for example. So I think the arc of learning should be started from the hardest way.
Mm,
For me, at
mm,
least, that seems to me to be the most productive way to do it, because
mm,
you can have the general context with a book, and then you can pose better questions about the topic itself, and then you can go more
mm.
specific as you go. So this is a long way of saying that I don't necessarily like to use LLMs as soon as I want to learn about, or I don't, it's not the first thing I do if I want to learn about something. I also, even when this arc is like progressing, I would stop before the LLMs, because I have this fear. Yes, exactly. I have this fear of kind of outsourcing, as I said, my brain to this tool for some reason. I don't know. I don't have the feeling with a Google search that I'm outsourcing, but I have this feeling with an LLM, because it's kind of giving me, it's giving me the answer that I want, not the answer that I need, if that makes sense. I feel
It does
like,
make sense.
because, yeah, because it's too specific towards the prompt itself, because it has been trained from
Ah,
the entirety of the internet. And so it has all those inconsistencies embedded in it at the same time. And so it's giving you whatever you're telling it through the prompt in an implicit way. So I have this fear that eventually it will give me the answer that as I said, that I implicitly showed in the prompt, not necessarily the answer that I need. And also, this also taps into the idea of insightful questions. Insightful answers. I think the most insightful answers are usually indirect for some reason. Like I've never had, or at least the most euphoric aha moments are the ones that are kind of indirect and unpredictable.
Yes. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you're reading some kind of book and then you link it to some other question that you had like 5 years ago. And that seems to be the most euphoric aha moment. So I think LLMs kind of go in contradiction with this idea of the most insightful answers are indirect because they give you the most direct answers that you want, which is, I don't know, I feel like it takes, and the way I think about like, it takes away from the value of I guess the research process. I would say maybe you can
Mm.
add to this from your perspective, but also like another point I would say is that I usually think of technologies not necessarily as a solution to a problem, but as a trade-off first.
Oh.
Obviously, it's a solution, but the first thing I would say, or the way I think about technology, especially in light of this explosion of like, let's say, different technologies in the world, whether it's social media or whatever, I don't think of it as a solution. I think of it as a trade-off. So what am I trading off when using this technology? So you can take the basic example, I don't know, of maybe a car, for instance. So a car is a solution to a problem, but also at the same time, it's a trade-off of
Because you're not
you
walking.
walking.
Yeah. 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 You're not
Exactly.
walking. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So it's a solution to a problem, but it's also trading off your leg muscles, let's say, with time, for instance. So that's how I think of technologies, and I kind of act accordingly, if that makes sense. Now, I'm not saying that LLMs are completely like should not be used or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that's my, I guess, quirky
Yeah.
personality that
No,
I don't really want to outsource my thought process to this machine, I guess. Yeah.
it's brilliant, and I'm really glad you said it. And how old are you, if you don't mind my asking?
Um, yeah, sure, sure. I'm 25. Just
Oh
turned
man,
25.
interesting. So
Yeah.
25. I don't know if this was an Eden McGilchrist, but I believe the number at which the prefrontal cortex solidifies is at 25 years old. Um,
Mm.
so I think at your age, it's actually the best, most perfect thing you can do, because I think what you just talked
Okay.
about is the biggest problem. Everybody's talking about alignment, and the AI is going to kill us all, and it's all sci-fi bullshit. Like it's not real. Excuse my
Yes.
French. Like it's
Yeah.
what is
No.
the
No. No. Go
real
ahead.
pro yeah, what is the real problem? The real problem is that kids are going to do what you just said, which is they're going to lose that ability to think on their own. So it's a really, really interesting avenue, and I think you're at the perfect age to do it. I think for my age, I'm 39 years old, so I'm about to turn 40 years old. So for me,
Mm.
most of my solidification has already happened a long time ago. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't mean to say that there's no like I'm still 3 years away from another important biological landmark, which is 42, when my metabolism will start to decrease. And
Mm.
so that's a big one, and that'll be a big drop off. And then there's another one at 60 years old. And so maybe that's what's going on, is that I use LLMs for this because I am on a time limit, a strict time limit. I think there's a lot of avenue to play here. I don't think these are like, because this gets back into that observer thing. Like I'm not a scientism person. Like I don't think that I think all these little things like, oh, you lose your prefrontal cortex at 25. We can't learn languages. You can't do all this stuff. I think a lot of it's dependent on a whole bunch of things that we don't know, are unseen.
100%.
Yeah, unseen things.
Yes.
Yeah. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, agree. Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think like also like for me, also part of my I guess learning process you could say is just actually sitting and thinking about something. So I don't really like to get the answers instantly. So when I'm just thinking, I would formulate a question and try to answer it with myself. And then I would like seek those mechanisms. So I think an LLM is not necessarily like I don't know, I would say it's not perfectly aligned with the way I learn. So I like to really take
Mm,
a long time thinking about things. Even I'm a very slow reader. So sometimes it would take me like, I don't know, a whole year to finish a book, for instance, sometimes.
mm,
So I really take a long time to kind of digest information and try to think about it. So I think this instant way of just trying to like, I don't know, trying to ask this machine some questions is not the way
yeah.
I learn in some sense. I think it's more interesting also in the in the context of conversations. Like questions for me are more interesting in the form of conversations because I feel like there is more territory for exploration there than the LLMs, for instance. So yeah, I think generally speaking, I would say it literally outsources your brain as you think about it, as you like progress and use it more and more. But as you said, given the context of what you just mentioned, which is it depends on what stage you are, it depends on the context. And I think this is one thing that we kind of lost in the culture, which is we don't think of technologies, as I said, as trade-offs. We think of them as solutions that could apply to everyone. But the
Mm.
truth is, it's a trade-off that is contextual. So it depends on the person who's using it, let's say,
Yes, yeah,
and then it
exactly.
depends on whatever the tool is. So I think this is like also one, maybe to use the word we used before, a curse of this age, which is just applying these technologies and thinking they're solutions to everyone in every place. But I think that's a really wrong way of thinking about it. I think the more clear way to think about it is to think about it as a trade-off first and then as a solution second.
Yeah, yeah, I love it. Um, the so how do you learn what do you I imagine you studied medicine, so you have a STEM sort of avenue towards your learning. How do you learn
Yes.
from a book with humanities, and how is that different or similar to the way that you learn from a STEM avenue?
Okay, that's interesting. I would say that the nature of the books I read are mostly not STEM related,
Mm.
I would say. Like the most of the books I would say I'm kind of interested to delve into are more into philosophy, generally speaking. And
Mm.
then if there is something embedded in it, in some science that I have to understand, I
Oh,
would go
cool.
and read it. But I don't take some,
Wait,
yeah. So I
how do you
don't
go
take
and read
some
it? How do you go and read it? Is it
like
online that you read it, or do you find a book?
yeah, for example, I can find a book and then just read parts of it, not necessarily the whole thing.
Yep.
So that's one thing I do. Like I don't necessarily read the whole book. Or for example, I have this infinite notes, literally, about almost every topic you could think of and some thinkers that think about this topic. So every time I'm like thinking, okay, I want to study this, I would go to this thinker and just see what they have linked to their works or whatever. And then I would read the articles or the books or whatever. So that's the way I learn. So I wouldn't say I delve into science or STEM like directly. I almost like this has been happening like for a long time ever since I started my learning journey, which is I start with the philosophy, and then as I said, if there's something that is poking me towards the science, I would go and research about it and then come back to this idea of philosophy. So I think that that's the
Mm.
main and I think that kind of puts me away from the category of a true generalist in a way. I'm not sure if you maybe you can add this, but a lot of generalists rather they like to delve like straight into almost all topics. But for me, I would
Mm.
say I like to start with philosophy, and then whatever the book takes me, I just go there in some ways. So I think that kind of takes me
Oh, I
away
like
from
that.
the category of a generalist. Or
Well, yeah, I don't understand how that doesn't make you a generalist. How the focus
ah,
on
okay, interesting,
philosophy, how does the
interesting.
focus
Okay.
of how does the focus on philosophy separate from other generalists?
I think most generalists would say that they're willing to delve into all topics, including the science, let's say, as a starter. But for me, I think
Oh,
I have
interesting.
to
Yeah.
link this idea of philosophy to the science in order for me to be interested enough to delve into the
Yeah,
science,
yeah,
if
yeah.
that makes sense.
It does make
So I'm
sense.
not interested, yeah, I'm not interested in science per se, but I'm interested in science as a consequence of philosophy, just to think about those philosophical questions that I'm kind of thinking about or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's why I said that it might take me away from the category of a generalist. But as I said, yeah, I think a generalist, I think that's the best definition I would say is a person who likes to keep open threads. So that would put me back into the category, I guess,
This is the hard
of
part about
generalist. Yeah.
categorization as well. As categorization is a this is one of my favorite topics that I learned from Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which is that
Oh my God, I
yeah,
love it. I love it.
there,
John
there-
Vervaeke. Yeah.
yeah, he's talking about a force of nature. So he talks about how the Hebrews, but not only the Hebrews, a whole bunch of other sort of traditions that started before the written word have all these categorization things where they say eating pork is bad because eating pork is dirty, and there's all these intercategorical things. So when there's an intercategorical thing that we as early humans didn't really know how to place in a category, that was bad. So that was a bad thing. And so shrimp and I don't have all the good examples of it, but there's all these examples of things that are outside of categories and they cause the human horror and terror,
Yeah.
which I find really interesting. Um, but so I love this distinction. I think what that does is that makes you a philosopher, not necessarily a generalist. And it also reminds me of something I've been on the trail of since I started writing this book, is that there is the history of science, there's the philosophy of science, and both of those things have essentially, because of the scientism thing, have been ignored by academia. I mean, they study them. There are people studying them, but they don't value them because they're, again, it's
Okay.
interdisciplinary type of things. And this is gets
Hmm.
back to our specialist versus generalism, and it's also related to like just where we are economically, because a lot of people sort of are in developing countries, but even within developed countries are trying to get out of the economic cycle. And the way they do that is by getting the professions with the most status. And the professions with the
Hmm.
most status are scientists, or not even scientists, it's engineer and doctor. Engineer, doctor,
Yes,
lawyer,
exactly. Makes sense.
those types of things, right? And
Yeah.
all of those things are now in this sort of accreditation type of thing, where in the U.S. and every other country, including Argentina, where I am right now, you have a association, you have the bar, you have all these steps that you need to do. And with the more people trying to enter those professions, those steps become harder and harder to limit the amount of people who can do it. And it also wraps up into academia, because academia is starting with the rise of big science in the 1930s and the 1940s, when we could essentially harness
Hmm.
the power of a neutron, but we needed billions and billions of dollars and large teams. All of that happened within the university, and then the university became integral to this sort of research that could lead to billions of dollars of revenue. Goes back to that highly practical question in the book of the business. But
Yeah.
this is essentially like but and then it created scientism as a religion that now has a giant army of believers who, in my
Yeah.
personal, somewhat controversial opinion, have essentially been discredited in the last 5 years. And it definitely discredited from my observation. Like, I don't trust scientism anymore. I think that it's corrupt. And I think that and I think other people are starting to realize that. Um,
Mm.
but we're like, but so it's the special, and so that religion basically says you must specialize at all costs. So you have to
Mm.
specialize, and you don't have time to connect your discipline to any other discipline. Um,
Yes.
and so it sort of makes people like us, and then maybe this is why I'm so angry at them, is that I've just been ignored for the past 30, my whole life, of
Yeah.
essentially like this guy who can't do anything because he's opening up all these threads and everything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think all of the economic incentives are kind of pouring into people being specialists in a way. And I think it started out as an economic thing, but then it leaked itself into the culture. So you see people like, for
Interesting.
example, when you ask them certain questions, they're like, this is not my domain. And
Yeah.
then they would shun you off
Yeah,
for
and
whatever
I don't care.
reason.
I simply do not
But I
care.
think
Yeah.
exactly. But I think the natural state of the human is that we're generally curious about
Mm,
many
mm,
things. So
mm,
I don't see
mm.
this the point of just trying to focus on one specific thing, let's say. And I think we kind of see it even our at our personal lives. Like we have to kind of, even though we're generalists in principle, but we have to like kind of specialize, on the side. We kind of have to choose something in order to make like money in some ways, I think,
Yes, yes.
at least in
Well, for
principle.
now,
So I think exactly.
because
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
think
With the
LLMs,
AIs, it might change.
yeah. I
Yeah.
think LLMs are about to change what you just said really, really quickly, and all of a sudden, generalists are going to become really important after being ignored for a really long time. But that just might be my cope, right? Like that just might be my desire to see that happen. But I think it's going to happen finally. My time has come.
Yeah.
But
100%. Yeah.
Yeah, which is why I love. talking to you because you have essentially like you have not built that intuition with the LLMs for I think a very, very good reason. Um, uh,
Yeah,
and man, it might almost be interesting to like to figure out a way that you could learn it on the tail end of your thing. So to put an LLM at the end at the edge case, maybe it's like a human. Maybe you
okay.
need to get another human being to research it for you with an LLM,
Ah,
so that they can essentially like be a filter, which I've started to think
okay.
about how we can actually because I although I use them all the time, I do think that they represent a huge trade-off in your framework that like
Yes.
there are going to be really big societal problems coming down from these trade-offs and they won't be
Yeah.
sci-fi, they'll be kind of sci-fi, but they'll be deeply human problems, like things that we've that'll just magnify things that like the dopamine loop that we were talking about earlier about how like this
Yep.
algorithm just essentially sucks our attention in for some subconscious process that has to deal with the market. Any thoughts there for the last 10 minutes?
100%. Yeah, sorry.
Any thoughts there for the last 10 minutes?
Yeah, I think like 100% when it comes to like the LLMs themselves, I would say that, as I said, thinking about them as a trade-off would be the thing that actually makes sense. And I think people kind of nowadays, the problem with it is not using it as a tool. Like you can use it as a tool and
Yeah.
kind of benefit
Yep.
from it. But
Yep.
the problem is that people conflate those things with it being a tool and with it being a truth generating, like
Yeah.
let's say
Yeah.
machine,
Interesting.
for instance.
Yeah.
So people conflate those two things and then they don't see it as a tool. They see it as the truth.
Yeah.
That's a problem,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But if you're always like seeing it as a tool, then that wouldn't be a problem. But I wouldn't be so sure that we can actually see it as a tool all the time. I would say that as we use it, as we gradually like kind of as it
Yeah.
builds into our
Yeah.
consciousness, we would have to kind of slide into that other conclusion, which is that it's the truth, let's say.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a super interesting topic. And I would say that the only thing I use it with actually, which is interesting, is not asking questions, but sometimes I use it, for example, to build some project, for instance, as an example. So if I don't have, for example, the coding skills to build some kind of a feature, I would go to an LLM for a very specific reason to write, for example, the code. I would say that's the exception that I would make with LLMs. Maybe I have to integrate it in some way more,
Are you
but
building
yeah, I think that's the only.
applications? Are you building applications with?
I did.
Yeah.
Yes, I actually did for my previous businesses, and
Huh.
nowadays I'm actually building an Arabic book summary platform. It's gonna start as a book summary platform because I think there is a very much a scarcity in Arabic. I wouldn't say content, but by the way, all the summaries are written by me, so it's not written by LLMs, which is something I'm kind of branding in that idea or company I'm starting.
Go more
Anyway,
into
so
what do you mean by that? What do you mean by all the you're getting it to
so
do summaries, but you're writing the summaries?
no. Yeah, exactly. No, I'm getting it to do it. Like, for example, if I want a specific feature, the UI, for instance,
Oh,
like let's say I wanted to, for example, scroll in a specific way. I would say that, for example, build that feature with the AI, but then the summaries themselves, the content of like
oh.
the summaries of the book would be written by humans, I would say.
You have the
Because I
most.
think
Yeah,
AIs, I'm
go
not
for
sure
it.
if,
Go for it.
yeah, go ahead.
You have the most
Yeah, I wanted to
interesting.
say that, like,
Yeah, go for it.
okay, go ahead, last one.
You have the most interesting way of working with an LLM because you're doing the thing that is the most the least hyped right now. AI building applications is the least hyped. There's so much hype in AI, most of which has to do with what we've been talking about as a truth, as the god, as like a the god of scientism. I just figured that one out just now. But so.
Yes,
But you're using it as a tool to build applications, which is the most practical. Like, if you learn how to do this, like it will guarantee you a job or a business. And so
yeah,
you're using it that way, but you don't use it for all these other ways that people are using it, including myself. Um,
exactly. Yes, even that I see it as a very much a trade-off. So sometimes if I, for
yeah,
example, if I have the principles to write the code, I would write half of it and then let it, like, for example, and so I have this very much like a weird way of like working with it, if that makes sense.
Mm.
So I would write, for example, the HTML and the CSS, which are the things that are I generally know how to write. For instance, if you have a background in like coding, and then, for example, the JavaScript of the animations, maybe I would use an LLM to help me write that, for instance, let's say. So even that, I'm kind of like very much cautious when I'm using it. But going back to the idea, it's basically like what I'm trying to do is bring a, I don't know, maybe it's probably very much cliche, but I'll say it as it is. But I'm trying to kind of bring a renaissance of reading when it comes to Arabic books
Mm.
specifically, you know,
Oh,
because I think,
cool.
especially when it comes to little kids,
Yeah.
it seems to me like the culture of reading, specifically Arabic books, for instance, or whatever, it seems to be it's I don't know, maybe it's probably vanishing or going away. So I'm trying to kind of tap into this problem and
Mm.
make it more interesting for people to kind of read. And I see those summaries as a portal towards generalism in a way. So
I've
I
got
don't see them as just giving people in a short instant some kind of information, but it kind of opens up a portal for them to research more things and think about all the things that I like to think about.
so
So
I've got
that's the thing I've been.
I've got somebody who I want to introduce you to, who is doing a similar project in the United States and has been doing it for like a decade, specifically
Mm,
focused on kids and Arabic, or maybe not even Arabic, Muslim. He's a Muslim who created a whole huge child book series. I don't know whether the books are in Arabic or whether they're just focused on Islam,
interesting,
but I would love to do that introduction. I haven't spoken to him for a long time,
for sure. Yeah,
but
that's
this has
super
been
interesting.
such a good episode. Really appreciate it. How can people find your YouTube channel?
My YouTube channel is from one ST, which is first principles with Thamir. You can find that, or also you can find me on X, which is Thamir's view. And
Cool.
hopefully I'll try to post this on my page so people can see it.